Would you pass me my handbag, please?
Certainly.
Just in case I need a hanky. Thank you very much.
Let me just, if I'm, oh yeah, no, that's okay. Right, I'm just going to turn you up.
Hello.
Hi. Lovely to see you, ladies. Yes. Why, was there trouble this time? I thought you might be down the beach. Not coming today. I thought you might have gone for a swim. Okay. Barbara, would you just give me a little bit of level? Testing, testing.
Hello, everyone. How are you today? This beautiful sunny afternoon.
That's good, isn't it? You can hear Barbara okay? Yeah? Right.
All right?
Marvellous. Yeah, I think we can, give me 5 seconds.
All right.
You ready to start?
You all right, though?
There's a bird up there, flapping its wings.
If you're all coming up here. Shall I turn you round, Barbara?
No. Talk to a vast congregation. It's all a big act.
Sorry?
It's all a big act.
Yes, sure. Right, okay.
Sorry.
That's okay. There we go. Just Carol finds it easier to hear up here.
Yes.
Yeah, but as long as you can hear,
Uh.
that's fine. All right.
So 5 seconds when you've gone through the door. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Pleased to see you on this lovely sunny afternoon. Thank you for coming. And welcome to all of you who will be watching online. We reach section 45 today, very nearly at the end of this course. And we've come to the climax, of course, with the 4th Gospel. But we're going to start with the question of the beloved disciple. Because the Gospel of St. John has evoked so many questions.
I'm ever so sorry, Barbara. I'm going to make you start again.
Right?
Your microphone is rattling against your lovely chain. So as you move, it's rattling. And that's going to come out on the recording. So if we just...
Right there.
Start again, please. Whenever you like.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for coming on such a lovely sunny afternoon. I'm surprised you're not at the seaside. But welcome to session 45 of this long course. We're nearly at the end now with session 45 with a look at the 4th Gospel. Well, the Gospel of St. John has evoked many questions because it's so different from the other 3. The other three, we remember, we call the synoptic gospels because they're so alike. And first question, who was St. John? Well, there's an icon with a question mark. Who was the John who wrote it? There are so many Johns in the whole of the New Testament that because then, like now, it was a very popular name. There was John the Baptist, John the son of Zebedee, possibly the beloved disciple, John the son of Zebedee, John the elder, the writer of the 3 letters in the New Testament, and possibly another John who wrote the apocalyptic book of Revelation. So for precise scholarly use now, the gospel is often referred to as the 4th gospel. And for many years, it was thought that this gospel had been written long after the 1st century because of its profound theology. Some even thought it had been written as late as 400 AD. But in 1920, archaeologists in Egypt found a tiny fragment of papyrus at Elephantine in the south, near the Aswan Dam. It had writing on both sides. And when they looked at it carefully, even though it was so tiny, it had writing on both sides. Have a look at it, front and back. That's all there is. Well, as you can imagine, it's been scrutinized very, very carefully. It's been dated with carbon dating from about 125. And this is not the original. So the original would have been written considerably earlier than 125 for a copy to have travelled that far south into southern Egypt. Well, that tiny piece of papyrus, as you can see, is so tiny, it measures only 3.5 inches in height and 2.5 inches in width. And yet, it's become the most valuable fragment of the New Testament and the earliest that we know. It's now in England, being looked after very, very carefully as part of the Chester Beatty manuscript, number P52, and it's in the John Rylands Library in the University of Manchester, where it is treasured very, very highly. And it is, in fact, the oldest known fragment of the New Testament in the world. It's transformed studies into the 4th Gospel and made scholars think again. Well, the accepted probable date now for the 4th Gospel is the last decade of that tumultuous 1st century. And we're going to recap on that whole tumultuous century just to put you back into the atmosphere of it. Back to sessions 33 and 34. So we've come a long way since then. At the time, when the priests of the Second Temple were living a precarious existence in the wake of the death of Herod the Great. Political and social turmoil had produced several subversive movements, and some of the Jews began again to ask when would God intervene on their behalf. Many leaders of these movements have been crushed and killed, including 2 from the New Testament story, John the Baptist and Jesus, though his movement had not died. But it has spread to many places around the Mediterranean, including Rome itself, when the Emperor Nero had killed many Christians, including Peter and Paul, in 64 CE or AD. And the biggest tragedy of all for the Jews in that century had been the complete destruction of the temple and the city of Jerusalem in the year 70. And this was done by the Romans, who were determined at long last to crush the Jews' political opposition. And they succeeded 3 years later when the fortress of Masada was conquered. After that disaster, only 2 groups of religious Jews survived. The Pharisees, whose scholars retreated to Yavne, or Jamni as it's sometimes known, and gradually codified their law in the Mishnah. And the other group that survived were the Christians, who'd retreated from Jerusalem just before that siege had begun. And they possibly went further south to Pella, near the Dead Sea. Well, by that time, 70 AD, only a few of Paul's letters and his essay to the Romans had been written, possibly because all the Christians were expecting the world to come to an end at any time. And times had changed. And when it became obvious that it was the temple, not the world, that had ended, we get to the remaining books of the New Testament, which were all written within the last 30 years of this century. That's all apart from the letters and essay to the Romans by Paul. So it's a very, very action-packed full century. And we've got a lot of dealings with the last 30 years. The strange thing is that all those documents written after 70 AD don't make a single mention of the disaster that had happened in Jerusalem. And as far as you're reading the Bible is concerned, you wouldn't know it had happened. But it did. But of the many possible texts for the New Testament, and there were plenty of them running around, the Gospels of Mark, Matthew, and Luke were later selected and used more often than any others, along with one other, the fourth Gospel, which was ascribed to a writer named John. Have another look at another icon of him. This one from the Lindisfarne Gospels. The question is, who was he? And it has intrigued people ever since. So let us go in search of him. We have to start, of course, with the Gospel itself. And there is evidence which puts its place of origin at Ephesus in Turkey, on the western coast. Bishop Papias, who was writing about 130, so within living memory of these people, is quoted as a hearer of John the Evangelist, or the Gospel writer. And the Hebrew mentions another John called the Elder. And their tombs lie together in Ephesus. Let's have a look at Ephesus. The long road into ancient Ephesus. And I haven't been there, but somewhere amongst the ruins is the tomb of John, in the middle of those columns, and there's another tomb to the side, the other John. So they lie together, each of which is John's, but we don't know which is which. Now, 50 years after that, a bishop of Lyon in southern France called Irenaeus was also writing about the Christian scriptures, and he wrote, "Then John, the disciple of the Lord, who also leaned on his breast," presumably at the Last Supper, "himself produced his gospel while he was living at Ephesus in Asia." So this is the evidence we have to locate the origin of this fourth gospel. And there's another author of the time who wrote that the church leader in Ephesus was from the priestly caste in Jerusalem, and he lived to a great age. So could it be that the author of the fourth gospel was none other than the beloved disciple? But the question remains, who was he? And what was his name? Oh, sorry. The beloved disciple who leaned on the breast. Everyone is entitled to have their own guess because nobody knows. And your guess is as good as mine. There's no evidence that we have to build on. Some people think it was, of course, John, the brother of James, the Galilean fisherman. And a lot of people think that. But it's highly unlikely, I'm afraid, that a Galilean fisherman could have written this exceedingly sophisticated gospel in Greek. Could it be the work of a Galilean fisherman? Well, it could, but it's highly unlikely. And I've heard many preachers making suggestions which range from Lazarus or Nathaniel, or even the unknown person who managed to get Peter into the high priest's courtyard after Jesus had been arrested. All suggestions. The truth is, we shall probably never know for certain. And my highly respected tutor in New Testament studies, Professor David Catchpole, wrote in a letter to me last autumn, "It doesn't really matter." So what are we making such a fuss about? But I have, however, a suggestion of my own to offer you. But remember, you are free to disagree. I like to ponder on the unnamed disciple of John the Baptist. It appears in chapter 1 of the Gospel, when John was saying to his disciples, look, go and follow Jesus, he's the one. This was after the baptism. And two of them went to follow Jesus. One of them was Andrew, the Galilean fisherman, and we hear more of him, but we don't hear anything of the other one. Andrew transferred his allegiance to Jesus, and the Baptist disciples, including Jesus, they would all have known each other well. We sometimes forget that. They had spent possibly 3 years learning from John Baptist, with all he could teach them before they were baptized. That's come from a doctoral thesis I read some years ago. But certainly they would all have studied and got to know each other. So when John the Baptist said, there's Jesus, follow him, two of John's disciples did, and they were both already friends with Jesus, and Andrew was one of them. After the baptisms, of course, John didn't hold on to them. He sent them back home to carry on his work wherever they lived. And we don't hear of this unnamed disciple again. Or do we? Question mark. Well, certainly not while Jesus was preaching and teaching and collecting disciples in Galilee, where he had come from, which suggests that the mystery disciple had not gone home to Galilee. Did he stay in Jerusalem? If so, was he of a priestly family who lived and worked in the temple and who would not have been able to go to Galilee? If so, he would have been much more educated than most of Jesus' Galilean disciples and able in Jerusalem to persuade the people there to listen to Jesus whenever he talked to them in the temple. Because we do know from the fourth gospel that Jesus went to Jerusalem several times during his ministry, which lasted considerably longer than the single year implied in the synoptics. Well, Jesus is likely to have acquired quite a large following in Jerusalem, in the group led by his unnamed friend, because we hear of his well-established friendship with Martha and Mary and Lazarus out in Bethany. And they offered him accommodation during his visits, plural. And of course, there's the owner of a large upper room in the city, not to mention the owner of a donkey who received the coded message and without question lent it to Jesus for his ride into Jerusalem before the Passover festival. And please note, quoting from the Gospel, chapter 12, when the crowd in Jerusalem heard that Jesus was coming, they went out to meet him. They didn't follow him from behind. They went out to meet him from the city. So he was obviously not a stranger there. We also know that at the Last Supper, the beloved disciple, whoever he was, reclined next to Jesus as of prime importance, the most important person there. Near to Peter, and that later this unknown disciple stood by the cross and was given the future responsibility of looking after Mary, the mother of Jesus. But we are now again into the realms of hypothesis, and you're free to be interested, to think, to agree or disagree as you will. But this hypothesis does rest on quite a strong tradition, and it goes like this. After the resurrection of Jesus, his followers from Galilee stayed in the city. But we do not get the impression that they joined up with the Jerusalem community that was already there. Peter, James, and John became the leaders of the group from Galilee, described by Luke in the Acts, as we've been hearing the last few sessions. But there's no mention at all of the others in the Jerusalem community. So presumably, they didn't meld together. After all, Peter's group had been thought of as country bumpkins, and sophisticated people don't always melt with country bumpkins. Well, Peter's group began to move away from Jerusalem after the death of Stephen, while Paul's group was centred on Antioch in the north, but the original Jerusalem group seems to have stayed in Jerusalem until they left for Pella just before the Roman armies arrived in 67. Therefore, they escaped the siege and the destruction of the city, and they didn't suffer themselves. Some scholars even think that there was a community of believing Samaritans that joined them at Pella. Do you remember in the fourth Gospel, Jesus met with the Samaritan woman, and a lot of her people were very, very interested in Jesus. Now, what happened to that group? We have no idea, but some scholars think there's evidence that they joined up with the Jerusalem Christians after the resurrection. Hypothesis, believe it or not. Don't have to believe it, you just think it could be true, or it may not be. But by now, in 67, the Romans were determined to crush the Jewish troubles forevermore. So they marched on southwards after Jerusalem, towards the Jews' last stronghold of resistance at the stronghold of Masada. That's another story. Pella was on their route. So, question mark. Did someone in the Jerusalem group of Christians there suggest that trouble was on its way and they should all emigrate? And did some of them have family links to wealthy traders in Ephesus and suggest that, well, they would be welcome to go there? Question marks. It's a possible hypothesis, particularly when you link up with the evidence of the gospel coming from Ephesus. There's certainly no record of any Christians being killed at Pella. They'd all gone. Well, there was already a flourishing Christian community in Ephesus, which had been founded by Paul many years before. And today, so I'm told, because I haven't been there, tourists are taken to several historical sites said to be connected with two Johns. One, the beloved disciple, who took Mary, the aged mother of Jesus, in his care, and the other known as John the Elder, who'd been a secretary to the equally aged, beloved disciple. What is in no doubt is that the main author of the fourth gospel was a very profound theologian of the same quality as Paul. They differed on several things, but they both agreed on the essential point that Jesus had broken the chains of the Jewish law by his death. Now, we've already followed Paul's argument in Galatians 2, when he got so angry with Peter, who'd left the Gentile Christians to eat with Jews only. But now in the fourth gospel, the author gives us one incident after another and meditative words from the mouth of Jesus himself, in which he continually asserted that the new order had superseded the old. So much the same message. In chapter 6 of the fourth gospel, there's a long discussion following the feeding of the 5,000, at the end of which, quote, many of his disciples turned back and no longer went about with him. It was a tough decision, but it must have echoed the atmosphere in Ephesus. Many other churches around that area, which had been founded in the Gentile diaspora, when in the years following the Jewish expulsion of all Christians from the synagogue, the Jewish Christians had to face the huge decision whether to stay with the new order or revert to their former allegiance, to give up on Christianity and return to the synagogues of their Jewish heritage. And we shall see later how important your former experiences matter when you direct the rest of your life. It acts like a rudder pointing you in a particular direction. So it really is a colossal decision to make a complete change to something new. In Ephesus and other communities founded by Paul, some Jews, and we have no knowledge how many, probably left the church, thus giving rise to the sad and bitter polemic against Jews of the synagogues that infuses many incidents within the fourth gospel. Their loss to that Christian community was serious. When they abandoned the Gentile Christians, they left them once again exposed to their own more familiar Greek ideas, able to accept Jesus easily as a non-human God coming down to earth from Mount Olympus. The balance between the two traditions had been lost. The churches began to suffer from the first big heresy it had to confront. It goes by the name of the Docetic heresy. And it maintained that Jesus had only appeared to be human. He couldn't suffer pain because he wasn't really human. He only seemed to be human. Well, the Gospels of Matthew and Luke had countered this with their birth narratives, but the fourth Gospel author emphasized details of Jesus' humanity, his anger, very human, in the temple, his very human tears at the tomb of his friend Lazarus. And the author then continued his meditation in chapter 15 to preserve the allegiance of both Gentile and Jewish Christians together, describing them as different branches, but of the same vine, unity in Jesus. And he also added this concern in Jesus' own prayer in chapter 17, Holy Father, protect them in your name so that they may be one as we are one. Well, the theology of the fourth gospel author was profound. not only in his insistence on unity among Christians, but also in his understanding of the person of Christ himself. And in this, the New Testament ideas have come full circle. For Paul, Jesus became the Christ at the resurrection. For Mark, it was the theophany at the baptism of Jesus, when the Holy Spirit appeared and said, "You are my son." Matthew and Mark write of it, as I've already said, in their birth narratives. And the fourth gospel theologian author finally wrote logically of it in his prologue, the beginning of chapter 1, that Jesus, having entered timeless eternity, where there are no differing tenses in the verb to be, always had been, always is, always will be, eternal. Or in other words, pre-existent. It's a logical argument, but a profound one. Well, he was no other than God's agent. This is Jesus. His word at creation, spoken in Genesis chapter 1, Exodus 20, and all through the Old Testament. This word, the Logos, can be traced back and equated by the wisdom myth of Proverbs 8, and quoted in the strange book of 1 Enoch. And we've dealt with the wisdom myths when we were dealing with the Old Testament, remember. The wisdom myth says that wisdom went to make her dwelling among the children of men, but found no dwelling place, just as Jesus had been rejected by his own people. But the author added, "But to all who believe in his name, he gave power to become children of God." Profound indeed. So now let's start to have a look at the gospel itself in a little more detail. A scholarly opinion suggests that it began not as a one connected story, but as a collection of deep meditations arising from a series of events in the life of Jesus before his last week in Jerusalem. Each one of these meditations is now a separate chapter in the Gospel. We have in chapter 2 the wedding at Cana and the revelation of Jesus' glory. Chapter 4 is the mission to the Samaritans, Jesus with the woman at the well, Jacob's well. Chapter 5, the stories of the blind man at the pool of Bethesda. In chapter 6, we have the feeding of the 5,000. In chapter 7, the preaching of Jesus in the temple about the law. 9, another blind man who gradually came to see and believe. And in chapter 11, the raising of Lazarus. The longest meditation of all is in chapters 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17. A long one. But all set into the context of the Last Supper before the Passion narratives begin. Strangely enough, in this Gospel, there is no account of the baptism of Jesus, no account of his call of the 12 disciples, or of his long ministry in Galilee. There's no declaration by Peter of his true identity, no mention of the Transfiguration, no narrative of the institution at the Eucharist at the Last Supper, and no mention of a trial of Jesus in front of the Sanhedrin. There are no parables of Jesus recounted, and there are 7 miracles which are called signs, signposts to help you on your journey to believe and to arrive for themselves at the true identity of Jesus and his relationship with God the Father. Now, the Gospel originally ended at the end of chapter 20. And the last verses there commend it to the reader to believe that, quote, Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name. A fitting end to the gospel. But it goes on. The later editor, possibly John the Elder, added an appendix in chapter 21, which includes the post-resurrection barbecue breakfast by the Lake of Galilee, at which both Peter and the beloved disciple were present. Well, this may or may not be so, but the final version of the gospel contains several themes which are developed throughout the course of the narrative, giving it cohesion and building up to the grand climax. Of these, three stand out very clearly. The theme of the hour is not yet come, but it is approaching. The second one is of the glory of God that is being revealed, and the identification of Jesus as the fulfillment of the Old Testament motifs in the 7 I am pronouncements. We have these 3 themes. The first 2 of them are found in the opening story of the wedding at Cana in chapter 2. When Mary turned to her son to help save the social disaster, he replied, "My hour has not yet come. Be quiet, woman." And at the end we read, Jesus did this and revealed his glory for the disciples. Well, with the abundance of excellent wine at the end of the wedding banquet, the reader is reminded not only of the heavenly banquet awaiting everyone, as described in the prophet Isaiah, chapter 25, but also the Old Testament idea of the marriage of Yahweh and Israel, which we met in the prophecy of Hosea. And these themes take us through the whole gospel, but there are others too which support them. In chapter 3, for example, Nicodemus came by night in the darkness of ignorance. Another motif to be contrasted with the light of true knowledge, and which makes its devastating impact again when Judas left the Last Supper to betray Jesus. He left. And the gospel says, and it was night. Chilly. And then the darkness of ignorance at the beginning of chapter 20 was shattered when the dawning light and truth of the resurrection happened. Now, all this is encapsulated in Jesus' words to Nicodemus in chapter 3, that God sent his Son into the world, that all people of the world, Gentiles as well as Jews, may turn from the darkness of sin to the new life in God. The 4th chapter introduces the Samaritans who did turn to Jesus in contrast to the Jews who rejected him. The story of the woman at the well is told with consummate storytelling expertise and much irony. The ordinary water of Jacob's well, symbolizing the law of Moses, is contrasted with Jesus' offer to give them living water, gushing up to eternal life. And when Jesus went from there back to Cana, the chapter finishes with a story of true faith, which is not dependent on signs or wonders. The story of the royal official who pleaded with Jesus for the healing of his son. And when Jesus said, "Go home, your son is healed," he believed him, turned around, went home without taking Jesus. In chapter 5, the healing of the blind man by the pool of Bethesda has similarities to such events recorded in the synoptics. But the 4th gospel places it in Jerusalem and introduces the conflict of Jesus with the Jews over their loyalty to the law of Moses, in contrast to the new freedom of his healing even on the Sabbath day. It's the most elaborate description of Jesus' supreme authority from God himself, contrasted with the Jews who clung to the authority of Moses, as so many were doing in Ephesus when the gospel took its form. The feeding of the 5,000 in chapter 6 introduces a very important chapter in this gospel. The enthusiasm that followed led to the possibility of a political uprising to replace King Herod Antipas with King Jesus. And fearful of following the fate of John the Baptist, Jesus went away for a while by himself, until during the night he joined his disciples in their boat, walking on the water, if you remember. And he engaged the crowd again next day in Capernaum with a long discourse, this time angering them, comparing the bread that came from Moses in the wilderness with the true living bread now on offer to them in Jesus, who made the first of his I am statements. I am, remember, was the translation of the word Yahweh, I am. And then we hear from him for the first time saying, I am the bread of life. The teaching resulted in deeper teaching, which would become the teaching of the church concerning the Eucharist. But again, it led to the result of the withdrawal of many who listened, but refused to hear. With Jesus' question to his disciples, do you also wish to go away? The gospel reaches the same crisis in the ministry of Jesus as is described in the synoptic gospels at Caesarea Philippi, where it was Simon Peter who answered, as in the fourth gospel, Lord, to whom can we go? You have the words of eternal life. We've come to believe and know that you are the Holy One of God. And on that high note, we'll finish for today. We'll continue next time, carrying on from there to the greatest climax possible, not only of this gospel, but of the whole Bible itself. And that will be in a fortnight's time on the 6th of June. The beloved disciple, the fourth gospel. Its climax, Sunday the 6th of June, at 4:30. And I look forward to seeing all of you there. Thank you for coming today. Goodbye.